The apartment in Tel Aviv overlooked the Mediterranean, not because it offered a strategic benefit, but because Sarah Kaufman, the Mossad director of operations in charge of the Special Operations Division, believed that difficult conversations should take place in places where people could look beyond the walls. Miriam Levy arrived at 2 p.m., punctual as always, wearing jeans and a simple white shirt, an appearance that communicated competence without ostentation. By the age of 32, she had completed 17 operations in 9 countries, all resolved without armed confrontation, all based on long-term infiltration. Sarah served Turkish coffee in small cups, a ritual that established rhythm for conversations that could not be rushed. Milan, Sarah said, passing dossier across the table. Late 1979. You will have approximately 8 months to build identity, establish presence, and create conditions for rapprochement. Miriam opened the file, her eyes scanning pages that detailed not a target, but a system. Youssef al-Nadim, 53 years, Lebanese citizen with passports from 3 countries. Officially, international investment advisor. Unofficially, broker between buyers and sellers of weapons, facilitator of logistics routes, intermediary who never touched products but controlled flows. He doesn't run an organization, Sarah explained. It is the infrastructure. It removes al-Nadim and conflicts lose the ability to arm themselves effectively. But it operates within legal frameworks, protected by layers of legitimate business and government relations that make direct action impossible. What's the point? Miriam asked, knowing that the answer would determine methodology. Live capture. We need it to be functional, cooperative, willing to reveal complete networks. Death would be counterproductive. It would create a martyr and a vacuum filled by successors. We need to dismantle the system, not just remove one piece. Miriam studied photographs of al-Nadim, an ordinary-looking man, well-dressed without being ostentatious, an expression that suggested calculated intelligence. Psychological profile? Highly functional, socially adapted, with no obvious narcissistic traits. It does not seek recognition. He does not make amateur mistakes. Their security doesn't come from armed guards or electronic systems. It comes from social predictability. He frequents the same places, interacts with specific circles, maintains routines that seem normal. And the breach? Sarah smiled slightly. People like al-Nadim trust those who don't seem to need them. He is suspicious of everyone who comes to him directly, but relaxes with those who cross his path naturally, with no apparent interest in his business. That's when Sarah presented the concept that would define the next 18 months of Miriam's life. She would not be an undercover agent. She would be a fashion photographer, a profession that offered access to elite circles without arousing suspicion, that warranted prolonged observation, that allowed her to build relationships based on art and image, rather than business transactions. You're not going to play a photographer, Sarah said. You're going to become a photographer. Full identity, verifiable history, real jobs. For the next few months, you will live this life until you are no longer a disguise. Miriam spent the next 6 weeks in a transformation that went far beyond false documents. He studied photographic theory with a retired professional who did not know he was training an intelligence agent. He learned not just technique, composition, lighting, editing, but the cultural language of fashion, how to talk about visual storytelling, how to navigate designer egos, how to build a portfolio that communicated sophistication without pretension. The identity built was Mara Levin, an independent photographer born in Buenos Aires, educated in Paris, specializing in discreet portraits of high-net-worth clients who valued privacy. The biography was not complete fiction. Real elements were woven into the narrative, creating tapestry that would withstand superficial investigation and even some levels of deep verification. The Mossad built verifiable track record. Small exhibitions in secondary galleries in Paris and Rome, editorials published in limited circulation magazines, documented collaborations with real designers who had been quietly recruited as unwitting collaborators, people who genuinely believed they had worked with Mara Levin because, Operationally, they had. Miriam arrived in Milan in March 1979. He rented a small but well-located apartment in Brera, a neighborhood known for artists and creative professionals. He set up a modest studio. He began to frequent the same cafes, galleries, and events where fashion photographers circulated. The first few months were an exercise in patience. She did not seek out Al-Nadim. He did not investigate their routines. She simply lived as Mara Levine would live, taking small jobs, gradually building a reputation, becoming a familiar presence in specific circles. Discipline was essential. Miriam knew that Al-Nadim had the resources to check the background of anyone who entered his orbit. The only defense against investigation was authenticity, to be so completely Mara Levin that there were not even micro-expressions of falsehood. She photographed low-key weddings of wealthy families. He made portraits of businessmen who wanted a professional image without ostentation. She collaborated on a minor fashion editorial for a Middle Eastern public-focused magazine, a deliberate choice that would eventually put her on the radar of middlemen who knew Al-Nadim. At night, alone in the apartment, Miriam kept 2 notebooks. One contained Mara's legitimate notes, ideas for projects, professional contacts, reflections on art. The other, hidden in a compartment she had built herself, contained operational observations, patterns she identified, connections she mapped, gradual progression toward the target. But something started to happen that wasn't in the training manuals. Miriam discovered that she liked photography. Genuinely. The way light transformed faces, the way framing created meaning, the way the image captured truths that words could not. She had conversations about art that completely absorbed her, forgetting for a moment that she had a hidden agenda. I woke up thinking about compositions for projects that no one had assigned. He felt real satisfaction when the client appreciated his work. The line between Miriam and Mara began to blur, not in a way that compromised operation, but in a way that made performance absolutely convincing, because it was no longer fully performance. The first indirect contact with Al-Nadim came in August, during a charity event at the Palazzo Reale, a discreet gala attended by businessmen, diplomats, and figures who preferred not to appear in society photographs. Miriam was there documenting the event for organizers, legitimate, well-paid work that warranted attendance. She saw Al-Nadim through the camera's viewfinder, a man of average height talking to a small group, a relaxed posture but eyes constantly assessing the environment. She did not photograph directly. He did not approach. He simply noticed and continued working. But Al-Nadim noticed her too, a photographer who worked discreetly, who didn't push cameras into faces, who seemed to understand the value of professional invisibility. 2 weeks later, Miriam received an invitation through an intermediary, a businessman from the Middle East, looking for a photographer for private portraits, someone who valued discretion as much as quality. The businessman was Al-Nadim's partner in a perfectly legitimate real estate venture. The door had opened, and Miriam Levy, being completely Mara Levine, crossed her. Their first meeting took place in September, in a cafe near the Duomo, a neutral venue, public enough to seem casual, discreet enough that conversations are not easily heard. Miriam arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, a habit of a professional photographer who values natural light and wants to choose the best angle. Or at least that's what Mara Levine would do. He sat by the window, ordered espresso, opened a notebook where he sketched ideas for future compositions. When Youssef Al-Nadim arrived, he did not come alone. An associate accompanied him, a younger man, probably a security guard disguised as an assistant. Al-Nadim wore a discreet suit without ostentation, an expensive watch, but not flashy. He moved around the cafe with the familiarity of someone who knew the space. "Miss Levin," he said in English with a slightly Arabic accent, holding out his hand. "Thank you for accepting the invitation." "Lord Al-Nadim," Miriam replied, shaking her hand firmly but not excessively. "Have I been informed that you are looking for a photographer for discreet work? I'm looking for someone who understands that certain people prefer to be documented without becoming a spectacle." He sat down, gesturing to the associate who could wait at an adjacent table. His previous work suggests this sensitivity. Miriam knew he had investigated. I expected that. The entire Mar 11 building had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of verification. I work mostly with clients who value privacy, she said. Businessmen, high-net-worth families, people who need a professional image without public exposure. And do you understand the difference between documentation and surveillance? The question was test. Subtle, but definitely test. Miriam kept a neutral expression. Photography is about capturing essence, not invasion. Good portraits require trust. Surveillance is the opposite of that. Al-Nadim studied it for a moment that seemed longer than it actually was. Then he nodded, satisfied. I have associates who occasionally need corporate portraits, documentation of private events, images for institutional materials. Irregular work, well paid, with an absolute expectation of discretion. Discretion is fundamental in my work, Miriam replied. Previous customers can confirm that. They talked for 40 minutes, about photography, about Milan, about the city's transformation into a cultural capital. Al-Nadim demonstrated genuine knowledge of art, making references to photographers whom Miriam, like Mara, was supposed to know. She responded appropriately, citing papers, discussing techniques, maintaining conversation at the exact level of professionalism without forced intimacy. By the time they parted, Al-Nadim had hired his services for a small event the following week, a private dinner where some of his associates would like discreet photographs for corporate use. Miriam left the cafe knowing that she had passed the first test, but also knowing that tests never really ended. Every future interaction would be continuous evaluation of authenticity. The following month set a pattern. Miriam, always as Mara, photographed 3 events for Al-Nadim's circle. He never asked about business. He never showed curiosity beyond the professional. He simply did exceptional work, delivered results discreetly, and accepted payment without negotiating values that were already generous. But more important than the works were the breaks between them. Casual encounters in art galleries, brief conversations at cultural events that they both attended, shared cafes where they discussed not business but art, philosophy, the changing nature of Milan. Al-Nadim began to relax in his presence, not completely, but enough for conversations to delve beyond professional superficialities. He was talking about Beirut before the Civil War, about how instability forced people to constantly reinvent themselves. She never mentioned her business directly, but through these conversations, Miriam mapped out her psychology. He was not an ideologue. He did not morally justify what he did. He saw himself as a facilitator in a world where demand would always exist regardless of his participation. Systems greater than individuals, he once said, always find a way to function. People who understand this thrive. People who fight against it are crushed. Miriam, like Mara, answered with calculated ambiguity. He did not explicitly agree, but he did not challenge either. It created a space where Al-Nadim could be honest without feeling judgmental. It was a strategy that worked better than I expected. And therein lay the danger. In December, almost 9 months after arriving in Milan, Miriam found herself in a situation she had not anticipated. She began to genuinely enjoy conversations with Al-Nadim. Not the man. She understood exactly what he facilitated, how many indirect deaths resulted from his business, but from his intelligence, from the way he thought, from the insights into human nature that only someone operating on margins could have. And that scared her. One night, alone in the apartment, Miriam opened the hidden operational notebook and wrote, "The line between Miriam and Mara is blurring. I can't determine whether emotional response is constructed or genuine. I need recalibration." But there was no way to recalibrate without breaking the momentum of the operation. Sarah, in sporadic encrypted communications, emphasized the importance of staying the course. You're exactly where you need to be. Trust is being built. Don't interrupt the process. The turning point came in January 1980. Al-Nadim invited Miriam, as always through Mara, to a private dinner. No business event, no photo shoot. Simply dinner. "You're one of the few people in Milan," he said when they met, "who seems genuinely uninterested in who I am beyond what I present." Miriam felt a potential trap in the statement. "We all have layers that we'd rather keep private," she replied carefully. "I respect that because I expect the same. But curiosity is natural. You never ask about my business, about my connections, about how I can pay so generously for relatively simple photographic work. I assume that if you wanted me to know, you would tell me." Miriam kept a light tone. "And frankly, clients who pay well and respect my work are rare enough not to take a chance with invasive questions." Al-Nadim smiled, a genuine expression that Miriam had learned to distinguish from the social smiles he wore in professional contexts. Honest pragmatism. It's refreshing. The dinner lasted for 3 hours. They talked about art, about photography as a form of simultaneous truth and lies, about how images could reveal and hide at the same time. There were obvious parallels to what they both did, she building identity through lenses, he building businesses through intermediaries. That's when Al-Nadim made a comment that Miriam would mentally write down as crucial. Successful people are those who manage to inhabit roles long enough to forget them, but not so much that they lose who they really are. Miriam felt the comment as a mirror, reflecting not only herself but potentially his self-awareness about his own role. "And can you maintain that balance?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I don't always know anymore." He paused, looking at wine in his glass. "Sometimes I wake up and need to remember which version of me I'm being that day." It was a moment of vulnerability. Small, perhaps calculated but present. Miriam recognized opportunity, but also recognized danger. Each revelation of his pulled her deeper into the role she was playing. Each moment of genuine connection made it harder to remember that it had an expiration date. When she returned home that night, Miriam did not open the operational notebook. He opened Mara's notebook and wrote reflections on photography, on how portraits capture masks that people wear, on whether it is possible to photograph someone's true essence, or just versions they choose to show. And only then, much later, did she realize that she did not know whether she was writing as Mara or as Miriam. The line wasn't just blurring, it was disappearing, and the operation was just beginning the most critical phase. February 1980 marked a subtle but significant change in the dynamic between Miriam and Al-Nadim. Meetings became more frequent, not just for photographic work, but spontaneous coffees, gallery visits, conversations that stretched for hours with no apparent professional purpose. To an outside observer, they seemed like an unlikely friendship between artist and manager. For Miriam, these were opportunities for mapping. Each conversation revealed an additional fragment about how Al-Nadim thought, who he trusted, where vulnerabilities existed. But they were also something more dangerous. Moments where Miriam constantly needed to remind her that Mara Levin wasn't real, that those conversations had an expiration date, that a connection that seemed genuine was an operational tool. In one of these conversations, Al-Nadim casually commented on security. "Have you noticed," he said as they walked through a contemporary art gallery, "that true security doesn't come from physical protection. It comes from being consistently predictable to those who observe, but unpredictable to those who threaten." Miriam recognized operational wisdom disguised as philosophy. "You build routines," she said thoughtfully, "that make surveillance lose interest because nothing ever seems to happen." Exactly. He stopped in front of an installation that used mirrors to create multiple reflections. People look for anomalies, so you live without anomalies, at least not visible. It was a moment of self-awareness that Miriam mentally filed. Al-Nadim understood that he was watched. He had built his entire life around managing that watch. Any direct approach would be detected immediately, which made Miriam's strategy, being completely who she pretended to be, the only one that could work. But strategy had an increasing cost. Miriam began to notice cracks in her own operational consciousness. In March, during a legitimate photo shoot for a client unrelated to Al-Nadim, She found herself applying techniques she had genuinely learned, feeling real artistic satisfaction when light captured perfect expression. By night, writing encrypted reports for Tel Aviv, she had increasing difficulty separating operational observations from personal reflections. Al-Nadim demonstrated increased confidence. Revealing details about future travel was mixed with, "We discussed Cartier-Bresson and the defining moment in photography," a conversation that made me reconsider my own technical approach. Sarah noticed the change in the reports. In a brief and carefully coded communication, she sent a warning. Operational proximity is reaching levels that require attention to psychological health. Consider the need for recalibration. Miriam responded with a statement that was technically truthful but emotionally evasive. Operation progresses as planned. Alvo shows growing confidence. Estimated window for final phase, 2 to 3 months. But he didn't mention that he woke up sometimes without immediately knowing if it was Miriam or Mara. He did not mention that conversations with Al-Nadim sometimes absorbed her so much that she forgot to catalog operationally relevant information. He didn't mention that he was beginning to feel anything dangerously close to respect. Not for what he did, but for the intelligence with which he did it. The final phase began to take shape in April. Miriam proposed a specific photographic project, a conceptual editorial essay on identity and performance, aimed at publication in an art magazine focused on a sophisticated international audience. The concept, she explained to Al-Nadim over coffee at her usual venue, explores how successful people construct public personas that are simultaneously genuine and performative. Executives, artists, diplomats, people whose professional identities become part of who they are. Al-Nadim showed genuine interest. "And do you see me as an appropriate subject for this?" "You're exactly the kind of person the project is looking for. Someone who has navigated multiple worlds, who understands the value of thoughtful presentation, but who also has depth beyond public image." It was true, technically. It was also perfectly calibrated bait. "Where do you envision doing these sessions?" he asked. "There is an industrial studio adapted outside the city, space used by photographers and filmmakers for projects that require total control of the environment. Private access, no outside distractions. Lighting I can completely control." Miriam paused as if considering herself. "But I understand if you prefer something in Milan. I know you value not straying too far from your routines." Al-Nadim considered for a long time. Miriam could almost see calculus at work, assessing risk, weighing confidence she had built against natural caution, deciding whether the control he valued would be compromised. "How much time would you need?" he finally asked. 3 to 4 hours, single, intensive session. I'll bring only essential equipment. Camera, basic lighting, nothing invasive." "And is it just you?" "Just me. This type of work requires intimacy. Presence of assistants or technical staff would destroy exactly what I'm trying to capture." Another moment of consideration. "So, when?" "3rd week of May. It gives me time to prepare the space properly." Al-Nadim agreed. And with that simple nod, the trap began to close. Miriam transmitted confirmation to Tel Aviv through secure channels. The answer came from Sarah personally. "Joint operation approved. Absolute compartmentalization. You'll get support, but you won't meet the full team. Legal warrant is already being processed through Italian judicial channels. When Al-Nadim enters the studio, he will technically be under international investigative jurisdiction." But the message ended with an additional line. "Upon completion, you will be extracted immediately for mandatory psychological debriefing. Extended proximity operations require structured decompression." Miriam knew what that meant. They had detected signs in the reports. They understood that the line between operational and real identity was dangerously thin. The weeks up to May were simultaneously the easiest and most difficult of the operation. Easy because everything was established. No more improvisation, just carefully calibrated plan execution. Difficult because each conversation with Al-Nadim carried the weight of knowledge that it would end soon. In one of these last conversations, Al-Nadim made a comment that Miriam would never forget. "You know, Mara," he said. It was the first time I'd used her first name so casually. "Part of me always wondered if you were exactly who you seemed to be. Not because of specific suspicion, but because, well, genuine people are rare in my world." Miriam felt adrenaline but kept a neutral expression. "And what conclusion did you reach? That if you were faking it, I would have detected it. I've spent my whole life reading people, identifying inconsistencies. You're too consistent to be a construct." He smiled. "Or, she's the best actress I've ever met." "Maybe," Miriam said with a smile that was perfectly calibrated between humor and sincerity. "We're all actors on some level. The question is whether we believe in our own roles." It was a response that allowed for multiple interpretations: philosophy about the nature of identity, veiled admission, or simply the artistic observation of a photographer who thought about performance and authenticity. Al-Nadim accepted it as the latter, but Miriam knew she had spoken deeper truth than he recognized, because at that moment, she genuinely didn't know anymore if she completely believed in the role she played, or if the role had become who she was. The date was set, May 21st, 1980, Industrial Studio 40 minutes from Milan, photo session at 2 p.m. And when Al-Nadim arrived, he would find not only Mara Levin with his camera, he would find Italian special operations personnel operating under international warrant, intelligence analysts ready to begin structured interrogation, and a judicial system that had already established legal jurisdiction over his business. But she would also find, Miriam knew with certainty, growing and uncomfortable, a photographer who had genuinely enjoyed her conversations, who respected her intelligence despite despising her business, who had lived so completely as Mara Levin that part of Miriam Levy had been lost in the process. The operation was coming to an end. But Miriam was beginning to understand that for her, the consequences were just beginning. The industrial studio was in a semi-abandoned area on the outskirts of Milan, an area that had been a thriving manufacturing district in the 1950s, but now contained mostly warehouses converted for artistic use. The specific building that Miriam had selected was legitimate, space actually used by photographers and filmmakers, with verifiable history from previous locations. But in the last 15 days, it had also become a joint operations center involving Mossad, Italian intelligence, and Interpol. Miriam had visited the site 3 times in the previous weeks, officially to prepare photographic equipment and test lighting. In fact, to coordinate with a team that he never fully saw but knew to be present. Compartmentalization was absolute. Miriam knew only her direct contact, a Mossad agent designated as Rachel, who coordinated through brief encrypted communications. He did not know how many Italian operators would be in position, where exactly they would be positioned, or how Al-Nadim would technically be detained. I knew only that when he entered the studio at 2 p.m. on May 21st, he would be under the legal jurisdiction of an international warrant that had been processed through Italian judicial channels with unusual speed, the result of coordinated diplomatic pressure. The morning of the 21st arrived with clear skies and pleasant temperatures. Miriam woke up at 6 a.m., brewed coffee, and spent an hour mentally reviewing each element of the operation. There was no nervousness. Years of training and 17 previous operations had taught him how to control adrenaline, turn it into focus. But there was something else, a feeling hard to define, which was not operational anxiety, but something close to anticipatory grief. In the next few hours, Mara Levin would cease to exist. The talks with Al-Nadim would end. The life he had built in Milan, authentic in every way except his stay, would be dismantled. Miriam arrived at the studio at 11 a.m. He set up real photographic equipment, camera, tripod, basic lighting. Everything worked perfectly because it was genuine equipment that she had used in legitimate work for the past few months. If Al-Nadim requested a demonstration, she could photograph him for real. At 1:30 p.m., Rachel sent confirmation via encrypted channel. Team in position, warrant confirmed. Proceed as planned. Al-Nadim arrived punctually at 2 p.m., driving himself, a fact that Miriam had anticipated based on patterns she had observed. He preferred direct control, avoiding relying on drivers when possible. "Mara," he greeted, scanning the space approvingly. "Impressive. Exactly the kind of environment I described, private, controlled, atmospheric." Miriam smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. "I wanted a space where we could work without distractions. This type of photography requires time. It cannot be rushed." They chatted casually while Miriam adjusted lighting. Discussion about the concept of the project, about how Al-Nadim wanted to be represented, about balancing professionalism and humanity in the image. It was during this adjustment that Miriam noticed something she had not anticipated. Al-Nadim was genuinely relaxed, more relaxed than she had ever seen him. I completely trusted that space, that situation, her. "You know," he said as Miriam positioned reflector, "there's something liberating about being photographed by someone who sees you as a person, not a function." Miriam paused, keeping memory of those words, not for operational report, but for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. "The best photography," she said softly, "always treats a person as a person, regardless of who they are professionally." That's when they heard a sound that shouldn't be there. An external door opening, multiple footsteps, coordinated movement. Al-Nadim reacted instantly, not with panic, but with immediate recognition of someone who had anticipated that possibility all his life. His eyes went to Miriam, expression transforming from confidence to understanding. "You," he said, not accusation, just affirmation. 6 Italian agents entered the main studio, guns pointed but a controlled posture. The team leader formally identified himself. "Youssef Al-Nadim, you are in custody by order of international warrant. You have the right to remain silent." But Al-Nadim was not looking at the agents. I was looking at Miriam. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been?" "Mara." Miriam could have remained in character, denied, kept disguise until the end. But something, professionalism, respect, or perhaps just plain emotional exhaustion, made her respond honestly. "From the beginning. Mara Levin never existed." Al-Nadim nodded slowly, processing. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, not angrily, but with something close to grudging admiration. "The best I've ever known, then. You did exactly what I said you would detect. You built identity too consistent to question, and I was arrogant enough to believe that no one could fool me." "You weren't fooled by the inconsistency," Miriam said, as agents approached to handcuff him. "It was for authenticity. I wasn't lying about photography, about conversations, about—" She paused, searching for correct words. "About respect for your intelligence." But he lied about everything else. Yes. Al-Nadim was handcuffed without resistance, completely cooperative while being read his rights formally. But before he was escorted out, he looked at Miriam one last time. "The picture," he said. "Were you really going to photograph, or was that also theater?" Miriam took the camera, adjusted the setting, and took a single photograph, a portrait of a man in handcuffs, a complex expression mixing defeat and dignity, lighting highlighting wrinkles that spoke of life lived on the margins. "It wasn't theater," she said, showing the image in the camera's viewfinder. "It was real." Al-Nadim studied the photo, then waved. "Keep that one, as a reminder of how well you played your role." He was taken away. The studio emptied quickly. Italian agents, support staff, all executing post-operation protocols with efficiency that came from practice. Rachel finally appeared, the first time Miriam had seen her in person. "Operation successfully completed. Al-Nadim is in custody, will be transferred to interrogation facility within 2 hours. You have a flight to Tel Aviv at 8 p.m. So fast. Standard protocol. Mara Levin's identity needs to be dismantled immediately. Apartment is already being emptied, records being erased. Within 48 hours it will be as if she never existed." Miriam looked around the studio, the space she had chosen, the lighting she had set up, the camera she held. Everything real, everything functional, everything part of life that would cease to exist in a matter of hours. And the photographic works, the actual clients I've had. They will receive a message that Mara has accepted a position abroad. She is no longer available. It happens constantly in this type of industry. No one will question it. It was perfect operational efficiency. It was also the complete erasure of 18 months of life that Miriam had lived so completely that parts of her had become real. On the flight to Tel Aviv that night, Miriam looked out the window as Milan disappeared below. He thought of Al-Nadim, probably already in initial interrogation, revealing networks that would lead to the dismantling of arms routes on multiple continents. She thought of Mara Levin, a photographer who never existed, but who had created real work, held genuine conversations, developed authentic skills. And she thought of herself, Miriam Levy, a Mossad agent whose most successful operation had been built on a foundation of authenticity that made lie indistinguishable from truth. The question that haunted her wasn't whether the operation had been successful. It clearly was. It was if part of Miriam had been permanently altered by the process of becoming so completely other that the line between identities had disappeared, and if so, which version of her was coming home. The Mossad's Psychological Debriefing Center was in a discreet facility on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, a building that from the outside looked like an ordinary corporate office, but internally contained specialized resources for agents returning from long-term operations. Rooms designed to look neutral but welcoming, monitoring equipment disguised as ordinary furniture, medical and psychological staff available 24 hours a day. Miriam arrived 3 days after leaving Milan. The first 2 days had been consumed by standard operational debriefing, detailed reports on every aspect of the operation, information on Al-Nadim patterns that could assist interrogators, complete mapping of contacts identified during the 18 months. She spent 12 hours answering technical questions, reconstructing chronologies, providing context for operational decisions. But the third day was different. Dr. David Resnick, a psychologist specializing in extended proximity operations, conducted an initial session that lasted 4 hours and marked the beginning of a process that would last for months. "Tell me about Mara Levin," he began, sitting in a comfortable chair that didn't look like interrogation furniture, but wasn't too casual either. Not as a request for operational information, but as a psychological exploration of territory that Miriam had not yet fully mapped. Miriam discovered that she did not know where to start. She was a photographer, he began automatically, reciting constructed biography. Born in Buenos Aires, educated in Paris, based in Milan, specializing in discreet portraits of— "No," Resnick interrupted gently, non-judgmentally but firmly. "Don't give me operational biography that you memorized. Tell me who she was to you, who Mara Levin was when you woke up being her, when you talked to Al-Nadim, when you photographed real clients." The distinction made Miriam pause, reorganize her thoughts, look for a deeper layer that she rarely accessed in professional contexts. When he finally answered, he was surprised by the vulnerability of his own words. "She was who I could have been if I had chosen a different life, artist instead of agent, someone who built connections through art instead of extracting information through deception, someone whose relationships were ends in themselves, not means to operational goals." "And you liked being her?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, faster and more certain than Miriam expected. More than it should, more than is safe for such an operation. Resnick made a note, a gesture that Miriam recognized as significant. Define more than you should. Proximity operations require performative authenticity, being convincing enough to fool target, but maintaining enough psychological distance not to lose operational perspective. Miriam paused, looking for honesty that was hard to admit. "I crossed that line. There were times when Mara wasn't performing. I was being Mara." The following weeks revealed the full extent of the problem. Miriam showed classic signs of operation-induced dissociation from identity, difficulty reconnecting with previous personal life, a persistent sense that genuine relationships were elaborate performances, an inability to determine with certainty when she was being authentic versus when she was unconsciously acting out. Friends who tried to reconnect after his return noticed change. "You seem to be always one step removed," a longtime friend commented over uncomfortable coffee, as if I were watching the conversation from the outside, assessing what response would be appropriate. Miriam could not deny it because she recognized truth in the observation. Every social interaction had become a conscious exercise, choosing words, calibrating tone, performing normalcy that should be automatic. "It's like," she tried to explain during a particularly difficult session with Resnick, "if part of me was still in Milan, I was still Mara. I was still waiting for the next meeting with Al-Nadim to discuss photography and philosophy. I wake up sometimes and don't immediately know who I am, whether I'm Miriam pretending to be Mara, or Mara discovering it's Miriam's construction, or something in between that has no name." Resnick nodded, making more extensive notes. Proximity operations create an impossible paradox that few fully understand until they experience it. To succeed, you need to be authentic. Sophisticated targets detect performance, but authenticity built on a fundamental lie creates a deep psychological fracture. You've lived as Mara long enough that she's become real. You've developed your own story, your own preferences, your own relationships, and now you need to mourn the loss of someone who never existed, but who was genuine to you. The observation captured exactly the strange, unacknowledged grief that Miriam felt, but had not been able to articulate. "I was mourning Mara Levine, a photographer who was never born, who never had a childhood in Buenos Aires, who never studied in Paris, but that he had lived 18 months of a completely fulfilled life in Milan, that he had created real artistic works, that he had held genuine conversations about art and identity. The following months were a slow and sometimes painful process of reconstruction. Miriam was removed from field operations, a decision that Sarah presented as temporary, but which they both knew would likely be permanent. She was assigned to analytical functions where she could apply expertise developed over years, without the need to construct alternative identities or live prolonged lies. He worked with a team that analyzed information obtained from Al-Nadim during interrogations that lasted for months. The man who had been so carefully protected, who had operated for decades without capture, now cooperated extensively, revealing networks he had facilitated, routes he had established, contacts he had cultivated over the years. The strategic impact was more profound than even Sarah had anticipated. Without Al-Nadim coordinating logistics with an efficiency that came from decades of experience, multiple weapons networks collapsed or became significantly less effective. Regional conflicts that would have escalated remained contained for lack of sophisticated equipment. Militant groups found that supply routes they relied on simply no longer worked. Analysts estimated that Miriam's operation, the capture of Al-Nadim and his subsequent cooperation, had prevented violent escalation in at least 7 different regional conflicts over the next 3 years. Lives were saved, hundreds directly, possibly thousands indirectly, through violence that never happened, because the means to carry it out never reached the recipients. It was a profound, measurable, strategically significant victory. Exactly the kind of success that justified unconventional methods and psychological risks for traders. But for Miriam, abstract numbers and strategic analysis did not change immediate, visceral reality. She had become so completely different that returning to herself required conscious, deliberate reconstruction, such as learning to walk again after neurological injury. 2 years after the operation, during a therapy session that was supposed to be routine but became decisive, Miriam made a decision that did not surprise Resnick, but that she herself took months to fully accept. She requested early retirement from active duty. "It's not a failure," Sarah said during a final conversation in her office overlooking the Mediterranean, the same spot where the operation had first been proposed. "It is an honest acknowledgement that some operations have costs that go beyond the physical, beyond even the measurable psychological. You executed mission perfectly. We achieved results that changed regional dynamics in ways that will impact security for decades or more. But method required personal sacrifice that cannot be ignored or minimized. Miriam nodded, deeply appreciating that Sarah, the person who had approved the operation, who knew its risks from the beginning, did not try to minimize consequences or present strategic success as adequate compensation for personal cost. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the future of an agent who had been one of the best in a specific type of operation that few people could execute. "I don't know yet." Miriam paused, allowing a light smile that contained irony but also genuine hope. "Maybe photography, really this time. I've found during those 18 months that I genuinely like, not as a cover, not as an operational tool, but as a form of expression and connection. And part of me needs to figure out if I can do that without it being an operation, without each image being a disguised strategy." Sarah immediately understood the underlying need. Reconstruct Mara Levin as a real person, but this time without Miriam Levy hidden inside, without layers of deception. Something like that. To find out if skills and passions that I developed as a construction can become authentic when they do not serve an ulterior purpose. Miriam left the Mossad 3 months later, with an appropriate pension for years of service and discreet recognition, not public medals or ceremonies, but a letter signed by a director acknowledging contributions that could never be publicly credited. He moved to Barcelona, a city where he had no operational history, where no one knew Miriam Levy or Mara Levin, where he could genuinely start a new life without the ghosts of previous identities. He enrolled in a formal photography course, sitting in class with students 10 years younger, learning techniques he had pretended to master but now really wanted to understand. She discovered, to her deep relief and renewed surprise, that skills developed as Mara were genuinely real. Not just convincing performance, but authentic competence that she had developed through practice and study she had done to make coverage believable. He had a natural eye for composition. He instinctively understood how light transformed subjects. He could make people relax in front of the camera, revealing aspects of themselves that they normally kept. They were abilities that Mara had possessed, but now belonged to Miriam. Over the next few years, he built a modest but authentic career. Professional portraits, occasional editorial work for cultural magazines, small exhibitions in secondary galleries in Barcelona, and occasionally in other European cities. It never became famous, never sought wide or commercial recognition, but he created life that was completely his own, without layers of deception, without identities built with an expiration date, without relationships that served purposes beyond themselves. There were still difficult moments, more frequent in the early years, gradually diminishing but never completely disappearing. Sometimes she woke up disoriented, not immediately knowing where she was, Barcelona or Milan, being Miriam or being Mara, living real life or performing an operation. Romantic relationships were complicated because part of her always remained slightly distant, assessing whether she was being genuine or performative, unable to completely turn off the analysis instinct that years of training had made automatic. But gradually, with years of ongoing therapy and patience with herself, the line between who she was and who she had been became clearer and more manageable. It hasn't completely disappeared. Deeply shaping experiences never go away. They just integrate into who we become. But it became something Miriam could live with, something that informed her work without dominating it. 10 years after the operation, Miriam received a letter from Sarah. Brief, carefully written so as not to reveal anything sensitive if intercepted, but communicating the essence of what it needed to convey. Al-Nadim had died in prison, natural causes after a decade of cooperating extensively with multiple international intelligence agencies. Information he provided had continued to dismantle networks, prevent conflict, potentially save lives well after his capture. The letter ended with a line that Miriam read several times. "Your work has had an impact that will continue to reverberate for decades, preventing violence that will never make headlines because it never happened. I sincerely hope that you have found peace with the cost you have paid to achieve it." Miriam kept the letter in a drawer where she kept few items from her previous life, not because she wanted to forget it, but because she needed physical distance to maintain psychological distance. He felt not triumphant satisfaction at the confirmation of strategic impact, but something more complex and mature, recognition that the method had worked exactly as intended, that lives had been saved through perfect deception, and that this did not make personal consequences less real or less significant. The following spring, Miriam mounted a photographic exhibition in a respected gallery in Barcelona. No longer marginal spaces, but a gallery that attracted genuine critical attention. Theme was identity and performance, a series of 23 portraits exploring how people construct public versions of themselves, how social masks gradually become part of who they are, how the line between authenticity and performance dissolves through repetition and compromise. One of the portraits, centrally positioned, lit with particular care, was of a man in handcuffs, a complex expression, mixing dignity and defeat, dramatic lighting highlighting wrinkles that told the story of life lived in margins. It was the only photograph she had kept of Milan, the only physical evidence of Mar 11 that had not been systematically erased by the intelligence machine. It did not include explanatory context, did not reveal who the subject was, or under what circumstances the photograph had been taken. It was simply portrait, powerful, technically impeccable, emotionally complex, profoundly human. Visitors to the exhibition stopped in front of that image longer than in front of others, interpreting it through their own lenses and experiences. Some saw a captured criminal facing justice. Others saw themselves as victims of an unjust system. Still others simply saw human beings in a moment of extreme vulnerability and forced transformation. No one knew the real story. What photographer had never existed as a born and bred person? What a guy had been one of the most effective weapons brokers of her generation? What captured moment represented the culmination of 18 months of deception so perfect that the line between truth and lie had temporarily dissolved completely? And Miriam realized, watching visitors interact with the work, that this was deeply appropriate, because the central question that the exhibition explored, what operation had forced Miriam to viscerally confront, was not about that specific man or that particular operation. It was about methods that used human connection as a weapon, about whether it is possible to instrumentalize trust, art, and genuine relationship without eroding the social fabric that intelligent systems are supposed to protect, about whether strategic victories, however significant, adequately justify the profound psychological costs of those who execute them, about where society should draw the line between necessary security and methods that violate fundamental assumptions about human trust. There were no simple or universal answers. The operation had undeniably saved lives. It was measurable, verifiable through analysis of conflicts that did not escalate, of weapons routes that collapsed, of violence that never happened. It had also permanently transformed the person who performed it. This was also measurable through years of therapy, relationships that never fully formed, moments of dissociation that never entirely disappeared. Miriam Levy had discovered, through a decade of careful reconstruction, that she could live with both truths simultaneously, that he could genuinely recognize the operation's strategic success while also honestly acknowledging its profound personal cost, that he could have built an authentic and meaningful life after years of living a lie so completely that it temporarily became truth more real than reality. She was no longer a Mossad agent. It was no longer Mar 11. It was Miriam, an established photographer, a respected artist in specific circles, person who understood better that most of the way identity is simultaneously constructed and genuine, how masks we wear can gradually merge with faces we inhabit, how authenticity and performance are not always clear opposites, but sometimes points on a complex spectrum. And sometimes when light was exactly right, and subject completely relaxed in front of the camera, she captured a moment of absolute truth, living proof that even after all she had experienced, after she had lived a lie so deeply that it temporarily became reality, she still fundamentally believed that genuine authenticity was possible and valuable. Only now she knew with painful clarity and hard-won maturity exactly how much it cost to achieve it, and how much it cost to lose it, even temporarily, even in service to a cause she believed was just.